It took just 47 seconds. That's all it took for a woman from South Dallas, a first-term congresswoman with no fancy lineage and no billionaire backers, to expose what 52 years of polished politics had tried to cover up. It wasn't a shouting match. It wasn't a viral stunt. It was quieter than that. Quieter and sharper. She looked Senator J.D. Vance in the eye, on live national television, and spoke just 9 words. Not to humiliate him, not to win points, but to name something America still struggles to admit, that this country doesn't treat all poverty the same way. The hearing room didn't erupt in applause. It froze. The cameras kept rolling. But the air, it thickened. Because when truth enters a room that's not ready for it, silence is the first reaction. And while millions would later replay that moment in clips and comment threads, most people missed what really mattered. It wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it, why she said it, and what it cost her to say it. This is not just a story about policy. This is a story about memory, about shame, silence, survival, and the quiet war that millions of Americans fight every day just to be seen. And it all began in a room where Jasmine Crockett wasn't supposed to speak loudly. But when she did, she didn't raise her voice. She raised the stakes. Now let's go back to that moment, before the cameras turned, before the storm broke, and see how it all began. The hearing room didn't buzz. It hummed, that low, dangerous kind of hum that comes before a storm, when the sky is too still and the air tastes like metal. Room 328A in the Hart Senate office building had seen its fair share of rehearsed outrage and scripted speeches, but not like today, not with her in the room. The walls, lined with polished walnut and engraved plaques, looked more like a theater set than a place where justice was supposed to live. Dozens of reporters fidgeted behind their tripods, wires tangled at their feet. C-SPAN's red light blinked steadily, a silent witness that something or someone was about to cross a line. The hearing topic officially was federal housing equity, but unofficially, it was power, territory, whispers of elections yet to come, and beneath the surface, something colder still, a test. Jasmine Crockett sat third from the end on the left side of the long mahogany table, flanked by aides with color-coded binders and barely concealed anxiety. Her navy suit was crisp but not loud, her earrings small and silver, her hands folded neatly over a worn leather folder that had been with her since her first courtroom. She didn't lean back. She leaned in, just enough to show she wasn't there to watch. Across the aisle, Senator J.D. Vance adjusted his tie. Not for the first time. It was already perfect, like most of his performance. His body language said relaxed. His eyes said calculation. He sat with the assured slouch of someone used to being the smartest in the room. The person who asked the question designed not to be answered, but to wound. He hadn't spoken yet, but Crockett could feel it coming. The room wasn't loud, but it wasn't quiet either. There was the sound of breath being held, fingers tapping on legal pads, the soft rustle of papers waiting to become headlines. Crockett didn't look at Vance directly, not yet. Instead, she glanced down at the edge of her folder, where a yellow post-it stuck out with 3 handwritten words. Not today. That wasn't strategy. That was survival. She remembered writing it just before Wheels Up in Dallas, after she'd skipped the staff dinner to reread case studies and rewatch an old documentary on redlining. She knew what this room was. It wasn't about debate. It was a coliseum, and sometimes the lions wore suits. Representative Barry Granger from Oregon was still speaking, droning on about modular housing grants and development incentives. His voice was background noise, the soundtrack of a system pretending to function. But Crockett caught something Vance did in response. A twitch in his shoulder, a glance toward her folder, a not-so-subtle breath in. He was preparing to strike. She felt it like static, that quiet shift in energy when a question isn't asked out of curiosity, but out of agenda, out of contempt. Vance didn't want an answer. He wanted a soundbite, and Crockett knew. She couldn't just answer. She had to redefine the question. And then he raised his hand. "Madam Chair," he said, voice syrup smooth, "I'd like to direct a question to Representative Crockett." The room tilted. Reporters turned. Aides froze. Even the cameras shifted, lenses hunting for her reaction. Jasmine didn't blink, but inside her chest, the storm had already started. J.D. Vance didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His question was crafted not in decibels, but in precision. Representative Crockett, he began, each syllable landing with polished ease, you've advocated for increasing federal housing funds in urban districts like Dallas. But how do you justify pouring more taxpayer dollars into cities plagued by violence, corruption, and chronic homelessness? Under your leadership, wouldn't more funding just prop up failure? He smiled faintly at the end. A lawyer's smile, tight, rehearsed, and meant to conceal the blade. He hadn't said black neighborhoods. He hadn't said minority-run cities. But he didn't have to. The implication was the architecture of the question itself. Urban equals broken. Broken equals irresponsible. Irresponsible equals unworthy. And in his gaze, steady, courteous, almost bored, was the confidence of a man who expected no real challenge. Just another progressive caught off guard, fumbling to defend the indefensible. Crockett knew the tactic. It was older than the room they sat in. Dress it up in data, but make the wound racial. Frame the issue as fiscal, but ensure the target is personal. Deliver the punch without ever raising your hand. The murmurs in the chamber softened to stillness. A few aides glanced up from their notes. A senator 2 seats away shifted ever so slightly. No one interrupted. Everyone understood what had just happened. The first shot had been fired. Jasmine Crockett didn't move, not an inch. She didn't twitch, didn't raise a brow. Her fingers remained laced on the leather folder. But inside she felt it. The old, slow burn. Not rage, not yet. Something deeper, a knowing. The kind of knowing that came from having lived through versions of this moment in different rooms, with different men, dressed in different suits. Some wore badges, some wore gavels, and some, like J.D. Vance, wore thinly veiled superiority. But this wasn't the first time someone tried to make her district sound like a war zone. Wasn't the first time someone looked at her constituents and saw only deficits. She could almost hear the buzzwords forming in the minds around her. Crime, mismanagement, wasteful spending, all masked for the same old face. These people don't deserve help. Still, Jasmine didn't speak. Not yet. Her stillness wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Because there's a power in waiting, an unsettling kind of power, the kind that makes your opponent overestimate their control of the room. And she let him have that illusion for just a second longer. She reached slowly for her water bottle, unscrewed the cap, took a sip, placed it down. Eyes still on her folder. Not a sound escaped her. Then her hand hovered, gently, just above the binder. Not to reach for notes, but to let the room know. She had them. She had everything. Data, yes. Reports, yes. But more than that, she had names. She had stories. And she had something no one on that panel could manufacture. Lived experience. Then she looked up. Just once. Just enough. I'm glad you asked, she said, her voice low, even and unmistakably steady. And suddenly, it wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning, wrapped in restraint. She didn't rush. That was the first thing the room noticed. After dropping the sentence, I'm glad you asked, Jasmine Crockett didn't launch into rebuttal or slam her hand on the table. Instead, she leaned back ever so slightly, as if to give the question space to echo. And it did. It rang in the quiet like a chime made of glass and steel, sharp, delicate, and dangerous. She reached down and slowly flipped open the leather binder in front of her. The pages were marked with tabs, some color-coded, others marked by small yellow flags that bent from being used too often. But she didn't grab the first page or the second. Her fingers glided past graphs and grant figures, past fiscal analyses and HUD reports. She wasn't looking for a statistic. She was looking for something else. Someone else. When she stopped, it wasn't on a spreadsheet. It was on a photograph, slightly bent at the edges. A laminated printout of a 2-story apartment building in South Dallas. Faded brick, peeling paint, windows covered in plastic instead of glass. She didn't lift it up for the cameras. She just stared at it for a second. The kind of stare that says, I've been here. I've stood outside that door. I know who lives inside. The tension in the room wasn't explosive. It was magnetic, a slow pull. Even J.D. Vance, for all his practiced detachment, found his spine straightening slightly. There was no witty rejoinder from him now. No smirk. Just silence. And silence was always her favorite place to begin. You asked about leadership, she said quietly. You asked why we should fund places like Dallas. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It didn't falter. It flowed, low, steady, with the weight of someone who didn't come to speculate, but to testify. Let me tell you about the Dallas I serve. Not the one you read about in headlines, not the one you wave around in talking points, the real one. Still seated, still composed, she tapped her finger lightly on the photo in front of her, not for show, but like someone pressing a pulse. In this building, she said, lives a woman named Miss Leona. She's 74. She worked as a nurse's aide for 36 years. Her pension dried up in 2009. She's been waiting on a Section 8 housing adjustment for 11 months. A pause. 11. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her tone didn't harden, but the words sliced with surgical precision. She calls our office every week, not to scream, not to demand, just to ask if anyone still sees her. And that's when it happened. The camera zoomed in just a little closer, not because anything explosive had occurred, but because something real was unfolding, and real in Washington was rare enough to be newsworthy. Crockett closed the binder softly, not with finality, but with control. So, Senator, she said again, more gently this time, I'm glad you asked. Because today, you're not just going to hear about programs. You're going to hear about people. And with that, the foundation was set, not for debate, for something deeper, something the room wasn't quite ready for. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to raise her voice, because she had something louder, the truth printed in 12-point font and backed by federal research. She turned a page in her binder, this time not to pause on a picture, but to reveal a section flagged with a green tab labeled simply, Contradictions. The air in the room shifted as the tone turned clinical, not cold, but focused. And focus, in a place built for performance, is disarming. Let's talk about data, she said calmly, since numbers tend to feel more credible than lives. She lifted a sheet, an official federal housing equity report from 2023, and held it, not to wave, but just high enough that no one could pretend they hadn't seen it. This document outlines poverty trends by region and demographic breakdown, and what it shows, she continued, scanning the room, is that the highest poverty rates in the country aren't found in Chicago, Baltimore, or Dallas. They're in rural counties across the South and Midwest. She looked directly at Senator Vance now. That includes your state, Senator. A pause, no reply, just shifting eyes and a few pens moving more quickly. Let's take Ross County, Ohio, for example. She flipped to the next tab. Population just under 77,000. Median household income below the national average. 1 in 5 residents live under the poverty line. And nearly half of the homes built before 1970 still rely on outdated heating systems, some without consistent access to clean water. She let that sink in before adding, almost gently, that's not a liberal city. That's not a failed urban government. That's not Dallas. That's home for a lot of your voters, isn't it? The question didn't need an answer. Now let me introduce you to Terry, she said, turning to a smaller packet of handwritten notes. She's 61, lives in a trailer on the edge of Chillicothe. The roof leaks. Her insulation's deteriorated. Her space heater broke 2 winters ago, so now she uses her oven for heat. When the electric bill spikes, she turns it off altogether and sleeps in her coat. No one moved, not even the senator across from her. She told a local reporter something that stayed with me, Crockett added. She said, they're always talking about big cities on the news. Nobody ever asks about us. Her eyes returned to Vance, but not with judgment, with something harder to dismiss, sincerity. You say cities are mismanaged, but when rural poverty explodes, it's complicated. It's the economy, it's infrastructure, it's legacy hardship. And maybe that's true. But if we can hold compassion for Terry's hardship, we can hold it for Miss Leona too. She slid the Ross County page to the edge of her desk so the camera could catch the header. United States Census Bureau. Poverty by county. No commentary, no flourish, just the facts, arranged like quiet indictments. Senator, I'm not here to pit one kind of suffering against another, she finished. But if we're going to talk about who's failing whom, we have to tell the whole story. And suddenly, the very data Vance had planned to use as a weapon became her shield. The silence following her words wasn't empty. It was full of recognition, full of something raw and unfamiliar in that chamber, shared discomfort. Crockett had taken her time, not to fill airspace, but to build a bridge no one expected between Ross County, Ohio, and South Dallas. And once the bridge was there, she walked right across it. These aren't two different Americas, she said softly. They're two sides of the same broken promise. J.D. Vance's jaw didn't move, but his fingers did. A single tap against his notepad, then another. His aides, who were sensing a shift they couldn't control, began scribbling. Notes, damage control, or maybe just a distraction from the weight settling in the room. Because what Crockett had just done wasn't political theater. It was something far more dangerous to the performance. It was real. She didn't look smug. She didn't even look triumphant. Her expression remained composed, like someone who had delivered bad news to someone she respected. Calm, necessary, undeniable. I talk to Miss Leona every week, she continued. She lives with rats in her walls and mold in her vents, and she still manages to ask how my team is doing. I've never met Terry in Ohio, but when I read her story, I felt like I had. She paused, eyes steady. Because people like Terry and people like Miss Leona, they're not each other's enemy. It landed like a pin dropping in velvet. They're just two women surviving in a country that makes survival political. And they're both being failed by a system that would rather debate their worth than fix their roof. You could feel the temperature drop, not from hostility, but from clarity. Crockett wasn't dividing the room. She was unmasking it. And for a moment, even her opponents knew it. I understand why it's easy to draw lines between us, she added. Urban versus rural, blue versus red, black versus white. But those are distractions. They keep us arguing over scraps while the foundation cracks beneath us all. Vance shifted again, this time folding his arms, not in defense, but uncertainty. Something in his posture betrayed it, the recognition that the usual playbook might not work here, that calling for accountability wouldn't land when the person across from you had just woven the struggles of your own voters into the tapestry you tried to rip. Crockett didn't press her advantage. She didn't need to, because she hadn't come to win a moment. She'd come to reframe the entire argument. There's this idea, she said, that poverty has a particular look, that it wears certain clothes, speaks a certain dialect, lives on certain blocks. But I've been to Jackson, Ohio. I've sat on porches in Pleasant Grove, and I can tell you, the faces are different, but the fear is the same. The cold is the same. The quiet desperation in the eyes of someone who just needs one thing to go right, that's the same too. No one clapped. No one dared. But from the back of the room, someone nodded slowly. Someone who didn't plan to. And Jasmine Crockett simply looked ahead. Not victorious, just honest. And completely unstoppable. Jasmine Crockett let the weight of her last sentence linger, not for drama, but for resonance. The room didn't breathe, and neither did she. Not yet, because now came the part that made people shift in their seats. The part that didn't just expose the cracks in a policy, but in the national psyche itself. I've noticed something, she said slowly, letting the words unspool without urgency, without apology. When poverty shows up in places like Ross County, when it touches white rural families, Washington calls it a crisis, a tragedy, an emergency in need of compassion. Her eyes moved from face to face deliberately. But when that same poverty lives in places like South Dallas, when the names are black, when the schools are crumbling, and the roofs are leaking, and the bills pile up 2 months too fast, suddenly it's a moral failure, a lack of discipline, a leadership issue. Somehow the same pain, when it's wearing a different face, gets called a different name. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. The force was in the clarity. That's not economics, she continued. That's bias. And it's baked into how we talk about solutions, how we decide who gets funded, who gets blamed, and who gets ignored. Senator Vance sat motionless now, but his stillness felt less like strength, more like pause, like he was deciding whether to engage or let the silence carry the burden. Crockett didn't wait for him. She wasn't speaking for his rebuttal. She was speaking for the thousands who'd never make it into a room like this one. When opioids devastate rural counties, we hold hearings, we pass relief packages, we talk about hope, she went on. But when gun violence grips a city block, we pass judgment. We talk about culture, we talk about failure, we talk about why those communities can't seem to fix themselves. Her voice didn't rise, but it deepened, carrying not just policy, but history. Why do we treat one struggle like a wound and the other like a stain? A pen clicked twice on the far right of the chamber. Someone coughed but didn't follow through. All attention remained on her, because what she was saying couldn't be unseen, one said, and it was hitting harder than anything in the folders laid across their desk. Think about what that teaches people, she said. It tells some Americans that their suffering is tragic, that they're worthy of help, of redemption, of a second chance, and it tells others that their pain is their fault, that if they'd only worked harder, obeyed better, been less difficult, maybe they wouldn't be struggling. She leaned forward again, not as an attack, but as a truth teller inching closer to the question no one dared to ask out loud. So I'll ask it for all of us, she said, eyes steady, voice low. What does it say about this country? That one kind of poverty gets help, and the other gets blamed. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was ancestral. It came from too many rooms that had been too quiet for too long. Jasmine Crockett had been calm, surgical even, dissecting policy, correcting narratives, drawing blood without raising her voice. But now something shifted in her tone. Not louder, just lower, more deliberate. As if what she was about to say wasn't part of the script, not for the hearing, and maybe not even for the world. There's something I don't usually talk about in rooms like this, she said, her fingers lightly resting on the edge of her binder, but not turning any pages. Because when you get personal in politics, people either dismiss you or try to use it against you. But I'm going to say it anyway. A small murmur fluttered in the back of the room. Some leaned in, others straightened. The rhythm of the moment had changed, not toward spectacle, but toward revelation. I was 13 when we got evicted. There it was, plain, sharp, true. My mom worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7. She cleaned offices before sunrise and stocked shelves after sunset. My dad had just gotten laid off from the auto shop. There wasn't any safety net, no cushion, just bills. She took a breath, not to compose herself, but as if she were walking back through the memory step by step, careful not to miss what it felt like. One afternoon we came home from school and all our stuff, couch, boxes, our little black and white TV, was on the lawn, just sitting there like it didn't belong to anyone, like we didn't belong to anywhere. She didn't blink, but her voice curled with restraint. My little brother thought we were moving. He was excited. He didn't understand. He asked which bedroom would be his in the new place. And I didn't know what to tell him because we didn't have a new place. In the front row, a young staffer who had been typing stopped. Another tilted his pen off the paper. Because this wasn't just a policy story anymore. This was a lived story, a memory forged in the kind of loss you don't quote in a press release. We stayed with my aunt for 2 weeks, then with a neighbor for 3 more. Every night we packed our things like we might not be welcome the next day. We brushed our teeth with bottled water. We pretended like it was all an adventure. But I knew better. I saw the worry on my mother's face every time someone asked, "How long are y'all staying?" She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The restraint in her voice did more than tears ever could. And we were the lucky ones, she added quietly, because eventually we got a small apartment. My mom never let us call it the bad side of town. She'd say, "It's not bad. It's just ours for now." And that's how we survived it. Not by pretending everything was okay, but by refusing to be ashamed. She paused, let the weight return to the room. So when you ask me why I care about housing, she said, eyes level again, you're not asking a politician. You're asking a survivor. And the hearing room, once again, had no words. They called it the bad side of town. The kids at school said it with a mix of pity and judgment, like they were describing something contagious. The teachers said it differently, more careful, more clinical. Economically impacted, resource constrained. But no matter how it was said, it always meant the same thing. A place no one wanted to be from. A place people assumed you ended up in because of some moral misstep, never because of the system. But Jasmine Crockett's mother refused to accept that, not out of naivety, but defiance. It's not bad, she would say, pulling the curtain tight at night when the street lamps flickered like dying stars. It's just ours for now. Jasmine remembered that sentence more clearly than most things from that year. It wasn't meant to comfort, it was meant to armor. Because when you're sleeping on someone else's couch, when the lights go out for the third time in a month, when your school bus ride takes you past liquor stores and payday loan shops, what you need isn't sugar-coated optimism. You need language that refuses to bow. Language that says, this isn't the end of us. They moved 3 more times before they landed in that apartment. The kitchen sink leaked. The carpet curled in the corners. The paint peeled like it was trying to escape. But it had walls. It had a front door with a lock. And it had space, a little of it, for hope. Still, the world outside didn't change just because they had an address. Jasmine's public high school, already under state review, lost its accreditation midway through her freshman year. Teachers quit mid-semester. The library was closed for repairs that never came. Advanced placement classes vanished without explanation. And when parents protested, the district issued a statement. We understand the concerns. We'll revisit funding in 2 years. 2 years. Jasmine remembered watching her mother read that headline in the newspaper, her thumb pressed hard into the edge of the page. She didn't curse. She didn't cry. She just folded the paper and tucked it into her purse like a debt someone would have to pay back later. Jasmine didn't understand all of it then, not the bureaucracy or the politics, but she understood what it meant to wait. 2 years wasn't just a promise, it was a sentence. 2 years was freshman and sophomore year. 2 years was the difference between catching up and giving up. And it was always people like her friends, like her teachers, who got asked to wait for justice, to wait for resources, to wait for the country to notice. But her mother never let the system's neglect define how they carried themselves. We don't live in a bad neighborhood, she'd say, passing Jasmine a spoon to stir the powdered milk. We live in a neighborhood that deserves better. It was a small distinction, but it mattered, because when the world says you're disposable, sometimes the greatest rebellion is believing you're not. And for Jasmine Crockett, that belief, that quiet, stubborn dignity, became the seed of everything that came after. Years later, Jasmine Crockett stood in a cramped county courtroom wearing a navy suit that didn't quite fit and holding a yellow notepad that trembled slightly in her hand. She was still new to the work, still finding her footing as a public defender. But something about this case felt different from the others, more raw, more personal. And she didn't realize why until the woman walked in, hands cuffed in front of her, chin lifted like someone who'd learned to take hits without flinching. Her name was Denise, 42, mother of 2, charged with misdemeanor trespassing. Her crime? Living. She'd been caught sleeping in an abandoned house with her children, ages 6 and 9, on a block where the other homes were empty, forgotten, windows blown out like teeth knocked loose. No heat, no electricity, no plumbing, but also no rent. It was the only shelter she could find after losing her job at a local diner when it shut down during the off-season. Now she cleaned offices overnight and dropped her kids off at school before dawn. Quiet, invisible labor that kept other people's lives moving while hers unraveled. Jasmine sat across from her during their first intake interview and asked gently, "Why didn't you go to a shelter?" Denise shrugged. "I did. They said they didn't have room for 3. A pause. And I didn't want to split us up." She said it so plainly, like it wasn't a tragedy, just a logistical reality. But Jasmine felt something crack just under her ribs. In court, the prosecutor read the charges with all the solemnity of a real threat. She unlawfully entered and remained in a structure without the owner's consent. Officers noted a makeshift bedding area, evidence of long-term occupancy, and 2 minors exposed to unsanitary conditions. Jasmine rose to respond. Her voice was steady, but her throat was tight. She'd prepped the legal arguments. She'd highlighted precedents. She had affidavits from school staff confirming Denise's kids had perfect attendance. But none of that was what she saw when she looked at her client. She saw her mother. She saw a woman who scrubbed toilets and stacked shelves and tucked in her children on other people's couches, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. She saw a woman who'd held dignity like a shield in a world that kept trying to strip it away. And for the briefest moment, standing behind a wooden podium in a room with peeling linoleum floors and broken fluorescent lights, Jasmine Crockett nearly lost her voice, not because she was afraid, but because the truth was suddenly too close to say aloud. She took a breath, closed her eyes for half a second, and then she spoke. "Your Honor," she said, "my client didn't trespass. She sought shelter. She protected her children. She made do in a system that gave her nothing. And if survival is a crime, then we need to revisit more than just her charges. We need to revisit our conscience." The judge said nothing, but something in the room shifted, and Crockett knew. This wasn't just about winning cases anymore. It was about redefining what justice even meant. There was a night early in her first term, before the spotlight, before the hearings, when Jasmine Crockett found herself in Jackson, Ohio, a place she hadn't planned to visit, but where something found her anyway. It was cold that evening, the kind of Midwest cold that cuts through wool and leather, that makes your breath feel like glass in your throat. She was in town for a small policy roundtable: rural housing, opioid recovery, community broadband. The room was half full, folding chairs, coffee in styrofoam cups, fluorescent lights buzzing above like nervous insects. After the formalities, a few locals stuck around to talk. One of them was a man named Ronnie. He stood quietly near the back, denim jacket faded, a ball cap with a Steel Workers Union logo stitched along the brim. His face was weathered, not just with age but with time, the kind that drips slow and heavy through long winters and longer disappointments. When everyone else had filtered out, he stepped forward and said, "You got a minute?" She nodded. Of course. They sat on 2 metal chairs by the coat rack. He didn't speak for a while, just rubbed his hands together like maybe the words needed warming too. "I'm 71, he finally said. "Worked steel for 35 years. Plant closed in 2009. Promised us a pension, never came." Jasmine said nothing. She'd learned long ago that silence, when done right, wasn't emptiness. It was invitation. He went on, voice low but steady. "I got Social Security, not much. Maybe $700 a month after insurance pulls out their part. Food pantry helps. Canned beans mostly. Keeps me fed." He looked down, then added with a soft laugh that didn't reach his eyes, "They say don't use your oven for heat. But when the space heater broke, I didn't have a choice." Jasmine felt her chest tighten, not out of pity but out of recognition. The way he spoke reminded her of the voices back home. Sparse, unadorned. People who didn't dress their pain up for sympathy. People who just got on with it. But it was what he said next that lodged itself in her ribs. "I don't care who fixes it," he said. "Democrat, Republican, Martian, don't matter to me. I just want February not to hurt." He said it so simply, so clearly, that it rang louder than any campaign speech she'd ever heard. February, not policy, not ideology. Just a month, a cold, endless month, and a man who wanted it not to feel like punishment. Jasmine sat still for a moment, then reached into her notebook and wrote one sentence in the margin. "He just wants February not to hurt." It wasn't a quote for headlines. It wasn't a statistic, but it was the truth. That night on the flight home, she read it again and again. Not as a reminder of poverty, but as a rebuke of how poverty had been politicized. Because Ronnie didn't care about talking points. He just wanted a warm room. And maybe someone who finally heard him. Jasmine Crockett let the story of Ronnie hang in the air just long enough. Long enough for the cameras to catch the discomfort on a few faces. Long enough for aides to stop pretending to type. Long enough for J.D. Vance to feel that shift, that moment when the hearing stopped being theater and started being truth. "You know what frustrates me most about these hearings?" she asked, tone even, but sharper now. "It's not the grandstanding. It's not even the statistics people misuse. It's the way we pretend that the poor in cities and the poor in small towns are living in different worlds, like they're two separate tribes." Her voice stayed low, but every word was a hammer. "We act like Miss Leona in South Dallas and Ronnie in Jackson, Ohio are on opposite teams, like only one of them deserves to be helped, like helping her means ignoring him. And that is the most dangerous lie we keep telling." Across the room, Senator Vance shifted slightly in his seat, not enough to be obvious, but enough for her to notice. "You play city versus country politics," she continued, turning her body fully toward him now. "But the pain is the same. Cold is cold. Hunger is hunger. Shame is shame." She didn't pause for applause. She didn't need to. "And what's worse," she added, voice tightening just slightly, "is that some of the people playing that game know better. They know these struggles aren't blue or red. They're just hard. And yet they still turn every funding bill into a battlefield." Then came the moment. The pivot. She lifted a page from her binder. Not a photo this time. Not a report. But a voting record. J.D. Vance's. She placed it on the table in front of her like a playing card laid face up. "You voted against the Rural Housing Stability Assistance Program," she said calmly. "That bill would have funded rehab projects for low-income rentals, assisted homeless veterans in small towns, and supported transitional housing for families displaced during the pandemic." She let it sit, then asked directly, without venom, without theater, just the question, "Why?" A slow exhale passed through the room, not from her, from them, because no one expected her to say it outright. But she had, and now it was there, on the record, like a stone in the middle of the path, too big to step around. J.D. Vance didn't respond immediately. He adjusted his pen, tapped it once, then looked at the chairwoman, almost as if waiting for a lifeline. None came. Crockett leaned back slightly, not to retreat, but to let the silence do its work. "You can't keep painting urban leaders as failures," she said, "while voting against solutions that would help people sleeping in trailers without heat in your own backyard." Her voice never cracked, but her conviction filled the room like rising water. "Because if you really believed in lifting people up," she said, "you wouldn't care what their zip code was." And with that, the divide she'd spent her career fighting against, the one designed to pit Ronnie against Miss Leona, was finally exposed for what it was. Not a policy difference, a performance. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. Something quieter and far more dangerous to the status quo was happening. Staffers stopped writing and just listened. A senator from a neighboring state, known for rarely crossing the aisle, shifted in her seat and nodded once. Even some of the aides who had looked skeptical earlier began to lean forward, not with agreement, necessarily, but with attention, with something approaching respect. Jasmine Crockett didn't change her tone. She didn't soften it either. She simply continued, steady as ever. "If we're going to solve poverty in this country," she said, "we have to stop dividing it by race, by zip code, or by who you voted for." She glanced slowly across the dais, not to intimidate, but to remind them. This wasn't theory. It was happening, now in their own states, in the neighborhoods their policies reached and failed. "Poor isn't a partisan category," she continued. "It's not a campaign slogan, it's a condition. And it looks different on the surface, sure. In Dallas, it's an apartment with no heat. In Jackson, it's a trailer with black mold. In Baltimore, it's a school with broken windows. In Appalachia, it's a house with no running water." Her words were deliberate, like bricks being laid one by one. But they didn't build a wall. They built a mirror. And yet we keep pretending they're different problems. That if you wear a suit and tie in a rural town, your pain is noble. But if you wear sneakers on a city sidewalk, your struggle is shameful. She let that hang, not out of theatricality, but because it was true. "And let me be clear," she said, her eyes locking with Senator Vance's. "This isn't just about what we fund. It's about what we believe. Because policy doesn't just come from numbers. It comes from narratives, from the stories we choose to believe about who is worth saving. There was no mistaking the challenge in her voice now, but still, no apology, no retraction. The system failed Miss Leona. It failed Ronnie. It failed the public school I went to that lost its accreditation and never got it back. It failed the mother who lived in an abandoned house because no shelter could take 3 people. Her voice didn't rise. If anything, it grew more intimate, more grounded in its conviction. And it failed not because it couldn't do better, but because we decided not to. That was the line, the one that tilted the energy in the room for good. One of the younger committee members looked down at their notes and then slowly set their pen aside. There was nothing left to write, nothing that could edit what had just been said. Jasmine Crockett folded her hands again, as she had at the start, composed, unshaken. "So let's stop pretending otherwise," she said, her voice now barely above a whisper, but cutting through the room like a floodlight in fog. "Let's stop acting like this is working for anyone except the people who already have everything." She didn't smile. She didn't grandstand. She just told the truth. And this time no one dared to interrupt. There was a moment, so brief it could have been missed, when the entire hearing room seemed to hold its breath. Jasmine Crockett had finished her indictment of the system not with fire, but with precision. And now she didn't reach for another chart. She didn't raise her voice. She simply lowered it. Her words slowed, not out of hesitation, but because the truth she was about to share required space to land. This wasn't strategy. It wasn't rhetoric. It was conviction. "I want to talk about something we don't mention in hearings like this," she began, her voice soft but grounded. "Shame." The word hung in the air like smoke from a candle just snuffed. The kind of shame that poor families are taught to carry. The kind that says if you're struggling, it's because you failed, because you didn't work hard enough, because you made bad choices. She looked down, not in defeat, but in reverence, as if calling out something sacred, something dangerous. But I've seen that shame up close. I've seen it when a mother skips dinner so her kids can eat, when a father lies to the landlord about when the check's coming, when a teenager hides the eviction notice in their backpack so no one at school finds out. Her voice didn't shake, but something deeper stirred beneath it. They don't call it shame in policy reports. They call it personal responsibility. They call it self-sufficiency. But let's name it for what it is: emotional punishment for surviving. There was no sound in the room now, no coughing, no typing. Even the usual creaks of chairs had disappeared. And then she said the line that stayed with her, the line she had heard every year since she was 13, the line that had saved her more times than she could count. "My mother used to tell me, don't let them shame you for surviving." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even a speech. It was a memory, one shaped in the fire of nights without heat and mornings without certainty. She said it when we packed our things into garbage bags. She said it when we sat in waiting rooms for hours just to get a name called. She said it when I got into law school and still couldn't afford a decent coat. She looked up and her gaze didn't shake. And I carry her voice with me into every room where people pretend poverty is just a number. I carry it because I know what it feels like to be told that your need makes you less, that your survival makes you unworthy. A pause, not for effect, but for air. "So no," she said finally, "I won't shout today. Not because I'm not angry, but because I want you to hear this without noise." She leaned in just slightly, her tone like steel wrapped in velvet. "There is no shame in survival. The shame belongs to those who build a system where surviving is the hardest part." She said nothing more. She didn't need to, because the room full of men with microphones and folders and polished shoes was for once completely, utterly quiet. The hearing ended without a final clash. No gavel slammed, no voices rose. People gathered their folders, murmured goodbyes, avoided eye contact. But the real moment, the one that would live far beyond those paneled walls, was already being clipped and shared by a junior staffer seated in the third row. She hadn't meant to start anything. She just knew what she'd witnessed needed to be remembered. 47 seconds. That's how long the clip ran. It started with Jasmine Crockett's voice, low and unwavering. "There is no shame in survival. The shame belongs to those who built a system where surviving is the hardest part. The camera caught her stillness, the lack of grandstanding, the quiet power in her face. Then a cut to Senator Vance, frozen in expression, silent. The clip ended with the natural room tone, the kind of silence you can feel pressing against your chest. By the time Jasmine stepped off the hill and into her rideshare, the clip had already hit 30,000 views. By the time she landed back in Dallas that evening, it had passed 500,000. By midnight, it crossed 2 million. The top comment on Twitter read simply, "She came with facts. He came with talking points." But it wasn't just the numbers that mattered. It was who was watching. On TikTok, users began stitching themselves into the clip. A college student in Arizona nodded along with tears in her eyes, saying, "My mom raised us in a car behind a grocery store for a year. I've never heard anyone talk about it like this." A former soldier shared how he hid his homelessness after returning from deployment, then whispered, "This isn't about politics. This is about being human." People weren't debating. They were remembering. They were finally saying it out loud. And then something unexpected happened. Calls started coming in, not from Democratic strongholds, not from progressive activists, from rural Ohio, Chillicothe, Circleville, Portsmouth, towns that had voted red for 3 election cycles. Towns where Senator Vance's name carried weight. But the callers weren't angry. They were relieved. "She's right," one man said in a voicemail, his voice thick with gravel and emotion. "I don't agree with all her views, but everything she said about housing out here? True. We've been forgotten too." Another came from a veteran, his tone clipped and matter-of-fact. "Tell Representative Crockett thanks." Someone finally said it. "We're poor, not stupid." And still another, from a retired school teacher. "I've never voted for a Democrat in my life, but if she ran here, I'd think about it." Inside Crockett's district office, staffers watched the numbers rise like floodwaters. Emails poured in, messages stacked. People didn't want policies. They wanted to say, "Thank you." And for once, the gap between the cities and the counties, the buses and the back roads, didn't feel so wide. For once, the truth traveled faster than the spin, and in homes across America, from trailers in Jackson to apartments in Dallas, people who had long ago given up on being heard themselves in her voice, and that was only the beginning. 2 days later, Jasmine Crockett sat behind her desk in the small district office tucked between a post office and a family-owned pharmacy on the south side of Dallas. The buzz of virality had reached them, sure, but not in the form of flashing lights or media trucks. It came in something quieter, something heavier. Mail. Letters, dozens of them, then hundreds, poured in through the front slot, slid under the door, dropped off by hand. There were emails too, of course, DMS voicemails, but it was the physical letters that landed differently. Some were handwritten, some typed, some scribbled in pencil on lined notebook paper. All of them carried weight. Devin, her youngest staffer, had just finished sorting the latest stack into piles when he held up 3 envelopes without saying a word. The first was from a veteran in Akron, Ohio. He had served 2 tours, returned home to find the factory closed and the bank calling. He had tried to get assistance, but got stuck in a loop of paperwork and silence. "I thought no one gave a damn," he wrote. "Then I saw your video. You didn't just speak for your people. You spoke for me." The second was from a retired pastor in West Texas. He'd spent 30 years preaching about compassion, but admitted in the letter that somewhere along the line, he'd started buying into the myth that poverty was earned. "You reminded me that dignity is not tied to a paycheck," he wrote. "I'm sorry it took me so long." The third was from a teenage girl in Alabama, 15 years old, living with her grandmother, her dad in prison, her mother gone. "Sometimes I feel like I don't matter to anybody," she wrote, "but when you said, 'Don't be ashamed for surviving,' I believed you. Thank you for saying it where everyone could hear." Devin placed the letters on Jasmine's desk, carefully, as if they were fragile. He hesitated, then asked, "Is this a win?" Jasmine looked up slowly. She didn't answer right away. Her hands rested on the wood grain of her desk, fingers spread like she was grounding herself. "No," she said finally, her voice low. "It's a reminder." Devin blinked. "Of what?" She picked up the teenager's letter, turned it over once, then looked out the window where a city bus rumbled by, filled with faces that would never see the inside of a congressional hearing. That we shouldn't need a viral video for people to believe our stories, she said. They should have cared when Miss Leona called our office 6 months ago. They should have cared when Ronnie's pension disappeared, when Denise was arrested for living in an abandoned house with her kids. The truth was always there. She paused. We just finally said it loud enough. Behind her, the wall was covered in pinned notes, photos, charts. But now something new took shape. An entire section of the wall was being claimed by letters. Staffers had started taping them up one by one, not as trophies, but as proof. Proof that someone had been listening, and someone had finally felt heard. The plane was already boarding by the time Jasmine Crockett arrived at Gate 18C. No entourage, no cameras, just a worn black duffel slung over her shoulder and a boarding pass marked Row 27, Seat B, the least glamorous seat on the aircraft, wedged between two strangers and an aisle far out of reach. She didn't mind. Coach was familiar. The soft roar of overhead bins slamming, the squish of two small seats, the quiet murmurs of travelers scrolling through text before takeoff. It was background music she'd grown up with. And tonight, after the whirlwind of headlines, hearings, and hashtags, she welcomed it. She stowed her bag, slid into her seat, and exhaled. To her left, a man in a flannel jacket was already dozing, arms crossed and mouth slightly open. To her right, by the window, sat a woman with a kind face and a small stack of manila folders in her lap, scribbling notes in the margins with a green pen. A teacher, Jasmine guessed. They sat in silence for the first 20 minutes, until the cabin lights dimmed and the plane leveled out somewhere above Missouri. The teacher turned slightly, glanced at Jasmine, and offered a polite smile. You live in D.C.? Jasmine paused, then returned the smile with a quiet nod. Sometimes I work there. The woman chuckled, softly, not unkindly. I figured, you've got that tired look people get when they try to fix things that don't want to be fixed. Jasmine let out a breath, half laugh, half confession. That's, about right. The woman studied her for a moment, then said, well, if you're fighting for people who can't afford first class, you're in the right row. It wasn't said with sarcasm or pity. It was said like truth, plain, earned. Jasmine blinked, caught off guard not by the recognition, but by the accuracy. Because this seat, this narrow, overused, barely reclining middle seat, wasn't just about travel, it was metaphor. And the woman beside her had seen it clearly. The people Jasmine fought for didn't fly priority. They didn't walk through velvet ropes or sip champagne 30,000 feet in the air. They flew middle seat, economy, last boarding group, tray tables that didn't lock, lives that barely held together. She looked at the woman again. What do you teach? 7th grade English, the woman said. Mostly kids who hate writing until they figure out it's the only way to be heard. Jasmine nodded. She knew something about that. They didn't speak again for a while, just sat side by side somewhere between cloud cover and city lights. And in that moment, Jasmine realized this too was politics. Not the kind that made headlines, the kind that sat in silence and still understood you. She didn't need a podium. She didn't need a stage. Sometimes being seen, really seen, by someone who's never watched C-SPAN, never donated to a campaign, never read a policy memo, was the clearest reminder of why she fought in the first place. Not for a soundbite, not for a title, but for the people who still fly coach and still hope someone in D.C. sees them. The building wasn't much to look at. A converted post office, half-painted beige, with a flickering fluorescent light above the front door and a handwritten sign taped to the window. Community Housing Q and A, 6 p.m. No reporters, no press team. Just a parking lot with uneven gravel and a row of folding chairs set up under buzzing ceiling fans. Jasmine Crockett walked in with no entourage, no makeup, no notes. Just a plain navy sweater, jeans, and the same leather binder that had traveled with her through courtrooms in Congress. She nodded at the volunteers, shook hands with the older woman pouring sweet tea into foam cups, and took a seat near the front. Lancaster, Texas wasn't flashy. It wasn't a photo op, but it was home in the way that matters. Familiar voices, real questions, and silence that came not from indifference, but from waiting too long to be seen. The chairs filled slowly. Grandmothers with scarves wrapped tight, teenagers on cracked iPhones, veterans with aching knees. They didn't come for slogans. They came for answers. But more than that, they came to be heard. Jasmine stood when called, no podium, just floor level, and gave a few remarks. Not a speech, just a rundown of where the new housing grant stood, what her office was fighting for, where the holdups were. She didn't promise timelines she couldn't deliver. She didn't talk like a headline. And that's why they leaned in. About 30 minutes in, during the open discussion, a man near the back stood up. He wore a faded green jacket with oil-stained sleeves and boots that had walked through more life than most policies were built for. He didn't raise his voice. He just asked, "Do they listen when you talk like that up there?" The room went quiet. Not heavy, just still. Jasmine looked at him, looked at the others watching. She didn't rush her answer. After a long pause, she said, "Not always." A small chuckle from someone near the coffee table. It wasn't cynical, just honest. Then she added, "But I don't speak for them." She stepped forward, just slightly, voice steady. "I speak so y'all don't feel invisible." And with that, the quiet shifted. Not because anything grand had been declared, but because the words were plain and true. She didn't go on. She didn't need to. The man in boots nodded once and sat down. For the next hour, they asked questions about heating vouchers, zoning reform, shelter overcrowding, about mold in schools and rent going up while wages didn't. And she answered everyone with the same calm conviction she'd used on the Senate floor. Only now it wasn't televised. It wasn't sound bites. It was service. When the last hand went down and the last cup of tea was poured, Jasmine stayed. She shook hands. She hugged necks. She listened to stories that wouldn't make the news. And before leaving, she stepped outside into the evening air, looked up at the sky darkening over Lancaster, and whispered the lines she carried like scripture. "Not always, but they hear me eventually." Because she wasn't there for applause. She was there to be the microphone for people who'd never had one. That night back in her apartment, Jasmine Crockett sat at the kitchen table. Lights dimmed, tea cooling beside an unopened laptop. Her shoes were off. The binder was still in her bag. She wasn't reading reports or drafting speeches. She was just thinking. It was something the job rarely gave her space for. Reflection. She thought about the man in boots from the community center, about the girl with shy eyes who asked if the grant would cover families with undocumented parents, about the woman who'd waited in line an hour just to say, "Thank you for not talking down to us." And she thought about something she hadn't had words for before, but did now. There are acceptable struggles in America, struggles that elicit sympathy, headlines, emergency funding. And then there are the ones we pretend are personal flaws. "You lose a factory job," she whispered aloud to no one, "and it's a tragedy." She stared at the window, the city lights outside blurring slightly through the glass. "But you lose your Section 8 housing, and suddenly it's your fault." She leaned back in her chair, arms folded, jaw tight. The double standard wasn't new, but it never got easier to face. A steel worker laid off in Ohio was interviewed for a Sunday profile piece. What happened to the American dream? A single mother evicted in Dallas is met with silence, or worse, judgment. She should have saved more. Same pain, different framing, but framing was everything. Because the way we talk about pain determines who gets help and who gets ignored. Jasmine thought about Denise again, the homeless mother charged with trespassing for sheltering her kids in an abandoned house. No one wrote op-eds about her. No relief funds came. No senators visited her in court. She didn't cry in front of cameras. She just held her head high, answered every question, and left the courtroom like someone used to carrying shame that didn't belong to her. And that's when it clicked. We don't just underfund people. We undervalue their pain. We decide, often unconsciously, who is worthy of empathy and who must prove they've earned it. "We call one trauma," Jasmine murmured, "and the other a mistake." She got up, walked to the counter, and poured out the now cold tea, but the thought stayed warm in her chest. Maybe that's why her speech has struck such a nerve. It wasn't because it was polished. It was because it refused to make those familiar distinctions. She hadn't just said poor people matter. She'd said stop dividing them by how palatable their pain is to your politics. Factory job, eviction notice, lost pension, denied voucher. Different circumstances, yes, but both are trauma, and both deserve policy. Both deserve respect. She wrote that sentence in her notebook before bed, underlined it 3 times, and added one last note beneath it. And neither should have to beg for dignity, because when the system forgets what human pain looks like, someone has to hold up the mirror, and Jasmine Crockett had no intention of putting it down. The next Monday, Jasmine Crockett walked into her district office 10 minutes early, coffee in hand and eyes sharper than usual. The quiet hum of printers, keyboards, and cheap fluorescent lights filled the room. Devin glanced up from his desk, surprised. "You're early," he said. "Not for this," she replied, placing her coffee down and unzipping her binder. "Let's get to work." They didn't need to ask what she meant. They already knew. The clip had gone viral. The letters had flooded in. The praise had echoed. But Jasmine wasn't interested in applause. Applause didn't fix mold in ceilings or cover broken heaters in February. Applause didn't extend vouchers, fund inspections, or hold slumlords accountable. But legislation could, and this time, it wouldn't be a polite request. This time, it would come with teeth. By noon, her policy team had cleared the whiteboard wall and started outlining the core. She didn't want another performative bill, heavy on poetry, light on power. She wanted mechanisms, triggers, consequences. "Start with enforcement," she said, tapping her pen against the whiteboard. "We're not begging agencies to follow through. We're requiring it. Clear timelines, mandatory audits, no more voluntary compliance." They nodded. Devin was already typing. "Next, housing discrimination reviews. Automatic when voucher denial rates hit a certain threshold in any zip code, rural or urban." Someone raised a hand. "Include school district displacement data." "Yes," she said without pause. "If housing instability is pushing kids out mid-year, we track it, and we trigger immediate federal review." Another hand. "What about redlining overlays?" "Build them in," she said. "Even if the maps are outdated, legacy damage still bleeds." By the end of the day, they had the first framework. They called it the Equitable Housing Accountability Act, but inside the office, they just called it the bill with teeth. Because it bit back. It didn't just ask landlords to behave, it demanded it. It didn't just expand funding. It tracked where the money landed, who it helped, and who it bypassed. And every clause was designed for both city blocks and country roads. "No one gets left behind in this one," Jasmine said quietly as she looked over the draft. "Not Terry, not Miss Leona, not Ronnie, not Denise, not that girl in Alabama who wrote me last week." They worked late, not out of obligation, but because the urgency was real. Because somewhere tonight, someone was boiling water on a stove to keep warm. Someone was calling a hotline that wouldn't pick up. Someone was sleeping in their car outside a school building that would mark them absent if they didn't make it inside by 8:01. The bill wouldn't save everyone, but it would start something firmer, sharper, built not just on sympathy, but structure. And as Crockett stood by the window that night, watching the streetlights flicker over the sidewalk where her mother once walked home after double shifts, she said just 3 words to herself, quietly but with certainty. "It's time now." By the 3rd week, the headlines had moved on. A senator's gaffe on a podcast, a tech CEO's meltdown on live television, a celebrity divorce that swallowed the news cycle whole. The algorithm spun forward, hungry as ever. Jasmine Crockett's hearing moment slipped quietly from trending lists and front pages, but not from the people who mattered. In small towns and city corners, in classrooms and break rooms and church basements, her words kept echoing, softly, stubbornly, like a song you don't remember learning, but somehow know by heart. In a 7th grade classroom in Tulsa, a teacher pulled up the 47-second clip before assigning an essay titled, "The Voice I Needed to Hear." Her students, many of them living on the edge of the same line Jasmine once crossed, watched in silence. One girl raised her hand afterward and said, "She talks like my aunt, but my aunt's never been on TV." In a Baptist church in Dayton, Ohio, a pastor quoted her during Sunday service. not with fanfare, but with reverence. There is no shame in survival. The shame belongs to those who built a system where surviving is the hardest part. He said it slowly, like a scripture, and then paused as his congregation sat in stillness, many of them nodding, some wiping their eyes. In Phoenix, a father who'd been laid off from his construction job pulled the video up on his phone and handed it to his teenage son. "Watch this," he said. "She's saying what I've been trying to explain." In a Detroit shelter, a mother with two kids clutched a printed-out transcript of the hearing, wrinkled, annotated, underlined. She carried it in her purse like a map, like proof. "When she spoke," she told a caseworker, "I didn't feel invisible." No trending hashtag could measure that. The moment hadn't vanished, it had just settled. Into the bones of people who knew the difference between performance and truth. Into the daily rhythms of those still checking the mailbox for relief that never comes. Into the hands of teachers cutting paper towel rolls in half because the supply budget ran out in September. They remembered. And sometimes that's how change starts. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. Not with fire, but with warmth. And though Jasmine Crockett didn't chase the next headline, she noticed the shift. In the way a local reporter called asking about the bill's status. Not the virality. In the way her voicemails weren't just from her district, but from school principals in Kentucky, from union workers in Indiana, from grandmothers in rural Georgia who began their messages with, "I saw what you said, and I've felt that too." It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was movement. Because when a truth is finally spoken aloud, clearly, unapologetically, it doesn't vanish. It roots. It becomes the thing people reach for in quiet moments. A line, a voice, a mirror. And if enough people remember it at the right time, that whisper can become a wave. She stood alone in front of the camera. No backdrop, no flags, no staffer holding a cue card just off screen. Just a dimly lit community room, a folding chair behind her, and the hum of a vending machine in the corner. Jasmine Crockett didn't smile. She didn't pose. She looked straight into the lens, as if, for the first time, there was no distance between her and the people watching. As if the walls of Congress had fallen away, and it was just her and the person on the other side of the screen, sitting together at a kitchen table somewhere in America. She took a breath, not to gather strength, but to release it. Then she began. "If we're serious about justice," she said slowly, deliberately, "we have to stop shouting at each other and start listening to the people we pretend to represent." Her voice was soft, but there was no doubt in it. We can't legislate from fear. We can't debate from ego. And we sure as hell can't fix anything if we keep dividing people by zip code, skin color, or party line. She took a step closer to the lens. Because when a family loses their home, the eviction notice doesn't ask how they voted. When a child can't sleep because the heat's been shut off, poverty doesn't care whether they live in Appalachia or East Dallas. Suffering isn't selective, but too often, compassion is. She paused, not because she needed to, but because the truth needed space. "I've seen a mother work 3 jobs and still get blamed for needing help. I've seen a veteran eat canned beans in the dark because no one kept the promises made to him. I've seen teenagers sleeping in borrowed vans, afraid to tell anyone where they live." Her voice didn't break, but her gaze deepened. "And I've seen lawmakers argue for hours about statistics while ignoring the stories standing right in front of them." She leaned forward slightly, not to persuade, but to invite. "So if we're going to talk about justice, real justice, then let's start here, by telling the truth." Her hand rested gently on her binder, worn at the corners, filled with pages that had passed through hearings and hearts alike. "The truth," she said, "is that the people most affected by our policies are the ones least likely to be heard. And if that doesn't change, nothing else will." She didn't blink. She didn't waver. She simply ended the way she began. Plainly, honestly, fully. Poor isn't a party. Pain isn't partisan. And truth, she let the last word settle, doesn't need applause, a beat of silence, then just above a whisper. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it. The camera stayed on her for 3 more seconds, then faded to black, and in that darkness, the echo remained. Not a speech, a vow. This story, like the people it represents, isn't polished. It doesn't follow a perfect arc. It doesn't resolve neatly in the final act, because real life rarely does. The mothers, veterans, workers, and students whose shadows pass through these pages are not caricatures of struggle. They are reflections of it. And though the names and settings may have been shaped by storytelling, the truth behind them is not fiction. It's what echoes in the silence after applause fades, in the spaces policy doesn't reach, in the hearts of those still waiting to be seen. If there's one lesson buried beneath every word Jasmine Crockett spoke, it's this. Justice isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who listens when the shouting stops. And maybe, just maybe, the most powerful voice in the room is the one that doesn't seek a microphone, but dares to speak anyway. Because silence doesn't mean absence, and survival is not a crime. Thank you for staying till the end. Your time, your heart, your presence matters more than you know. If this story spoke to you, speak back. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let's keep this conversation and this fight alive.